Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be here today. Since the first two speakers have taken up a little bit of time and we started very late, I want to do justice to the remaining speakers by keeping my presentation short. Let me begin by emphasizing that I think there are a number of features in the Sustainable Development Goals which are actually novel. And I particularly want to emphasize the emphasis on growth and employment, which was missing in the MDGs, and also on the relationship between inequality, justice, and peace, which is, I think, the ultimate objective of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this relationship is crucial, and I think many of you, as faith leaders, are also very concerned with this. And I think part of the problem in the world today is that we have a vacuum, a political vacuum, which the enthusiastic reception to the Pope, for example, is a recognition of this moral vacuum which exists, and the appeal of the Pope, who is speaking, in a sense, truth to power by addressing questions of justice. And this, I think, is very much, very, very important. Let me take a longer perspective on questions of problems of inequality. I think it is generally agreed that inequality, as we now know it in the world, is a relatively recent phenomenon, about 2 centuries old. And the great divergence basically begins from about 2 centuries ago. Now, more recently, I think it's important to recognize that there are differences within countries, which are, of course, very important. And much of the recent interest in discussions of inequality focuses on intra-country differences. But if you look at overall inequality in the world, you will find that about 2/3 of overall inequality in the world are actually between countries. So in a sense, to put it rather crudely, geography has become more important than class. And this is part of the reason why we have this ongoing challenge of migration and the desire to migrate, regardless of the questions of political unrest and so on. Now, if there has been, however, periods in which inequality did not continue to increase. For example, from around 1920, roughly from around the time of the establishment of the Russian Revolution, for instance, there was, as a consequence, the strengthening of labor movement, the social movement, and so on, which basically played a countervailing force and reduced inequality until roughly around the 1980s. 1980s, of course, with the rise of Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Reagan, we have, in a sense, the counter-revolution, and this begins a very, very drastic period. You, of course, see what happened in Russia during the early part of the 90s, when you had a huge increase, not only in inequality, but the collapse of the Russian economy by about half, and the increase of male life expectancy by 6 years, a phenomenon which has not been seen in the last 6,000 years of recorded history. This is incredible, and we should have to recognize some of the consequences. This bar chart is something which, it's a trick question. Let me ask you who you think is the richest person in the world compared to the rest of his or her society. And you might think it is Bill Gates or Carlos Slim or John D. Rockefeller. Historically, the actual answer is Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Okay? If you look at his income, wealth, in relation to the average Russian income. Now, there are various dimensions of what has happened in the last 200 years which have contributed to these inequalities. There are a number of phenomena associated with trade, including the most recent push towards trade liberalization, which have continued to undermine food security. In the last 3 decades, we have seen many countries which were previously food self-sufficient, no longer food self-sufficient. They are now forced to open up their markets, and this was even recognized by President Bill Clinton, who regretted forcing Haiti, for example, to open up to trade, which resulted in the collapse of Haitian rice farming and so on. So food security was undermined, and we also see the deindustrialization which was experienced. Notwithstanding the remarks made by our moderator, the fact of the matter is that the sub-Saharan Africa actually industrialized up to about the 1980s. And since the 1980s, sub-Saharan Africa has actually deindustrialized. There's also the huge problem of the so-called free trade agreements. Besides the fact that most of the free trade agreements have little to do with trade and trade liberalization, we also should recognize that much of the free trade agreements actually strengthen investor rights and strengthen intellectual property rights. And very, very important and perniciously, the whole question of what is called investor-state dispute settlement basically threatened to impose a very, very unequal legal regime for those of you who might be subjected to it. I say this because last week an agreement was made in Atlanta, Georgia, not Georgia, the country Georgia, but the state of Georgia in the United States, which basically threatens to the various partners because you basically have the strengthening of what is called ISDS. Now, the terms of trade, as anybody who follows the last century or so basically will tell you that primary commodities have declined relatively to manufactures. Tropical agricultural products have declined relative to temperate agricultural products, and developing country manufacturers have declined in terms of their prices compared to developed country manufacturers. This has all resulted in one of the great gurus of trade liberalization, Jagdish Bhagwati, over half a century ago, he talked about a phenomenon of immeasurizing growth. In other words, you can produce much more, but you do not necessarily become better off. You could actually become poorer despite being much more productive. And these are basically the graphs which show the phenomenon I was referring to earlier. The other more recent phenomenon has been what has been referred to as financial globalization, and much of this has happened since the 1970s. And I think it's very important to recognize that for various reasons, which I don't have time to get into, there has actually been an outflow of finance from developing countries to the developed countries for a whole variety of reasons. And this has not enhanced financial stability, and in fact, it has worsened instability and volatility. Now, all this basically is an indirect way of pointing out that what this phenomenon of financial liberalization and globalization, which has taken place over the last 4 decades or so, has basically not only been against development and against growth, it has actually had very direct deflationary macroeconomic consequences, and it has also resulted in the demise of development finance, and it has resulted in financial systems becoming much more exclusive rather than inclusive, pro-cyclical rather than counter-cyclical. And this, I think, are all problems which I think have been well recognized in much of the literature. Another major phenomenon which has is a relatively recent phenomenon is the strengthening of intellectual property rights. And the strengthening of intellectual property rights is basically empowering monopolies of those who claim such intellectual property. And this has been demonstrated more recently as not being necessary incentive for research and development and innovation. And we have, unfortunately, the strengthening of such intellectual property rights with the TRIPS agreement of the World Trade Organization with huge implications. Recently, for example, the Financial Times featured a young man who's made a lot of money and who basically has bought the patent for the cure to hepatitis C and basically has jacked up the price more than 15-fold. And he can afford to do so because he has the patent, and this is an enforceable thing internationally. And this has tremendous consequences for human welfare. And so what we have seen is that private greed has been enhanced at the expense of the public need, and this has been enabled by the kind of monopoly which has been endowed by the strengthening of intellectual property rights. Now, the unfortunate thing is that we are now in a situation where it is going to be worse, and it's almost impossible to reform the law for a variety of reasons, which I can't go into right now. We also have, as I alluded earlier to, a strengthening of international law in ways which are hugely problematic. I think we have to recognize that international law did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged at a time of the powers of imperialism, of colonial powers. Look at the League of Nations, for example, and to some extent you can see the development of international law as the product of what might be called palace wars. What we now have are situations where in the most crucial international financial institutions, very unequal voting rights. And the result of this, as President Klaus pointed out, is a result where you basically do not have effective ability to provide meaningful feedback. In the case of the European Union, for example, Europe has always insisted on having this excessive voting power in the fund, IMF, and as a result, it basically gave a blank check to the EMU, and the result, as he correctly pointed out, are some of the consequences we have seen in this country more recently. So all this has basically meant that the negotiating capacity of the South has been impeded, and to make things worse, the strength which the South was developing from around 1964 with the creation of the G77 and the creation of UNCTAD has basically, unfortunately, been weakened through a variety of actions which have resulted in divide and rule, and the more recent proliferation of plurilateral as well as bilateral agreements have in fact strengthened monopolistic powers in the form of investment rights as well as IPRs and the investor-state dispute settlements I referred to earlier. So where do the international development institutions fit into all this? I think what we have very recently, we had some checks beginning from around 1964, but not very, very effective. And I think what we need to look at is there's the advent of some of the new developments, particularly the emergence of the G20, the emergence of the BRICS, and the promotion of the Western media of the so-called Mint as a countervailing influence to the BRICS. And so you have, with the weakening of the South, you have, in a sense, a major change happening in Europe, where European social democracy is not what it used to be. It represents, in some ways, a very, very curious force in the world today. And I think what this basically means is that the very premises on which we analyze and understand the world has to be re-examined. Very importantly as well, in terms of the actual the international institutions. I won't call them development institutions because very few were created for developmental purposes. Besides UNCTAD, I think the only other one which can claim to be developmental is UNIDO. But let us take, for example, all of them have been constrained by the fact that you have zero growth budgets, and what you have is the significant increase in influence on the governance of these institutions, with the rise of the significance of the dependence on what are called extra budgetary funds. So within this context, one can recognize that some of the proposals associated with the SDGs represent a sort of a second best compromise, if you will. I would like to conclude by thanking Dr. Yakunin for providing us with this forum for discussing matters of global significance. He has demonstrated how one can be patriotic as well as internationalists at the same time. And I think this is extremely difficult to do in the world today. I want to thank the colleagues in the World Public Forum, as well as the colleagues, my colleagues from IDEAS, who have been trying to keep alive some of these very vital ideas as we try to debate the future of the world. Thank you very much.